Good morning. A leader and his political supporters arrested. Military vehicles on city streets. A state broadcaster says in a senior military official addressing a nation. But is it a coup d'etat? It depends on who you ask in Zimbabwe. The military is vehemently denying that its actions constitute a coup, even though it certainly looks like one. Additionally, the takeover by the armed forces has been relatively smooth and almost entirely bloodless, with the spokesman for the main opposition party telling the Globe that in Africa, normally there are dead bodies littering the streets after a coup, but there's nothing like that here in Zimbabwe. It's very unique. Zimbabweans are among the most tolerant people. Story continues below. Advertisement. President Robert Mugabe may technically still be in power, but his influence has certainly been weakened and a transitional government is expected. Zimbabwe has known only one leader since its independence from the United Kingdom, and a government led by someone who isn't Mr. Mugabe will usher in an era of uncertainty. But for many Zimbabweans, the decline of the dictatorship after 37 years offers hope for freedom and a new beginning. The socio-economic and political situation in the country had come to a head in recent weeks, as an internal power struggle had emerged in the ZANU-PF party that pitted Mr. Mugabe's wife, Grace, against a top advisor with ties to the military. So the change, although it may be uncertain, is certainly not unwelcome, given the crumbling economy and the rife corruption associated with the ruling family. This is a developing story and we'll continue to follow it. The Globe's Jeffrey York is Canada's only Time Africa correspondent and is on the ground in Harare. You can follow his reporting on Twitter and on our website as Zimbabwe enters a new chapter. This is the Daily Politics Briefing newsletter, written by Chris Hannay in Ottawa, Maya Zalam in Toronto and James Keller in Vancouver. If you're reading this on the web or someone forwarded this email newsletter to you, you can sign up for Politics Briefing and all Globe newsletters here. Have any feedback? Let us know what you think. We've launched a new Top Business Evening Edition newsletter providing a summary of the biggest business headlines of the day. Sign up for it and more than a dozen other Globe newsletters here. Canadian headlines as the federal Liberals mull what to do about Quebec's fee-covering law. Sources tell the Globe that the government is leaning towards intervening in the court challenge and not immediately referring the matter to the Supreme Court. Story continues below. Advertisement. Quebec says it will outline its framework for the sale of legalized marijuana today, though it is asking the federal government to delay implementation for another year. The Trudeau government is redefining its approach to peacekeeping, outlining a new plan to send equipment and troops to hotspots around the world while still keeping this country's current commitment near historic lows. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defended that approach at a peacekeeping summit in Vancouver. He insisted that avoiding committing to a single mission will allow the UN to ensure resources are deployed where they're most needed. Walter Dorn, a peacekeeping expert at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, says the Trudeau government is moving too slowly and should have come up with a more detailed plan by now. Mr. Dorn also points out that even with the increased commitment, Canada's peacekeeping force is smaller than it's been since the early 1990s. The federal government says it will allow provinces and territories to set up temporary sites for opioid users while they wait for permission to open permanent supervised drug use sites. Health Minister Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor also says existing sites will be allowed to offer drug testing to detect fentanyl and other harmful additives. The Alberta legislature has passed a controversial bill related to gay-straight alliance clubs in public schools, making it easier for students to join such clubs and preventing teachers from informing parents when they do. The United Conservative Party under new leader Jason Kenney opposed the bill. Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne says she never received the report that details mercury contamination in the water supply of the Grassy Narrows First Nation. The report was given to the provincial government in September 2016. Rob Clark, a former federal Conservative MP who was defeated in the 2015 election, has joined the race to replace Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. Story continues below. Advertisement. Construction workers who are building the controversial Site C Dam in northern BC are calling on the provincial government to proceed with the project. The Allied Hydro Council of BC says an independent review of the project by the BC Utilities Commission didn't adequately consider challenges of alternative energy sources, nor did it take into account the billions already spent on construction. A First Nation on BC's Central Coast says the federal government should create an Indigenous Marine Response Centre to bolster spill response on the province's remote coastline. The call for more First Nations participation comes amid a continuing debate about whether the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, and the associated tanker traffic it will bring, is too risky. And if you make more than $234,000 a year, congratulations, you're part of the 1%. Kevin Page, Claudette Bradshaw, Jeffrey Nelson and Tim Aubrey. The Globe and Mail on a national housing strategy. The policy stakes around a national housing strategy are high for Canadians. Canada is the only G8 country without such a strategy. There is clear and present danger throughout the sector. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corp.'s latest housing assessment warns that our market remains at a high degree of vulnerability due to price acceleration and overvaluation. This is a large macroeconomic stability risk. Policymakers are hoping for a soft landing. David Parkinson. The Globe and Mail on Ontario's economy. Windows of opportunity like this, a balanced budget, solid economic prospects, a generally improving global backdrop, rarely last for long. Already, the housing sector that has been a major growth engine in Ontario is losing momentum. The outlook for the province's key export sector is increasingly uncertain, as the renegotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement skate on thin ice. The government's projected balances could easily slip back into deficits, should the economic luck of recent years turn bad. If that happens, without a policy to turn the province's debt burden around, a major opportunity will have been lost, and future generations will pay the price. When this government draws up its pre-election budget next spring, it will have to ask itself if that price is worth a few votes. Andrew Coyne, National Post on Liberal promises. It is the language I find so fascinating. They had a choice, after all. They could have said the promise to reform the electoral system was broken, not unpursued, as it was open to them to say the promised open and transparent competition to replace the CF-18 fighter aircraft is kaput, not challenged. Did they think no one would notice? Do they take the public for children? Electoral reform has just gone to a farm, where it plays all day long with the other commitments that are not being pursued. Justin Ling, the Walrus on Liberal promises. The Trudeau government has spent an awful lot of time trying to short-circuit the fake news media to try and spread the good word. If I had to rank his progress on that front, I'd put it underway, with challenges. International headlines to navigate the future of EU-UK. Trade post-Brexit. The European Union is looking to Canada as a model. Specifically, they're looking to build off of the comprehensive economic trade agreement that became law earlier this year in order to meet demands put forth by British Prime Minister Theresa May. The calls for Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore to drop out continue to mount as more allegations of UAL misconduct emerge. U.S. President Donald Trump, who has been accused of UAL harassment and assault by more than a dozen women, was uncharacteristically silent when asked about Mr. Moore. The Democrat in the Alabama special election, Doug Jones, is polling unusually well, though he still faces quite an uphill fight. At least 10 employees in the U.S. Department of Justice are tasked with defending the U.S. president from 4 lawsuits that allege he is violating the Constitution because properties and companies that bear his name are earning profits from foreign officials and governments. The web of conflicts of interest were highlighted prior to the election, but Mr. Trump decided not to divest his business holdings after winning the presidency. Here's how a top DOJ official during the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton presidencies describes the situation. We've never before had a president who is branded, and it's impossible to divorce from that brand. It's blurring the lines because it's so unusual. I can't think of a precedent where another civil division lawyer has been called on to defend the president under these circumstances. Some Democratic members of Congress have introduced impeachment articles against Mr. Trump on the grounds that he obstructed justice, among other offenses. Lawmakers in Russia unanimously approved a bill that targeted international media by allowing the Kremlin to register outlets as foreign agents. The move comes after state-funded news network RT registered as a foreign agent in the U.S., following allegations from the intelligence community that it was a tool of the Kremlin to unduly influence the U.S. election. Innocent Maddowo. The Globe and Mail on what happens next in Zimbabwe. The first scenario is that Mr. Mugabe resigns immediately and Mr. Mnangagwa is promptly reinstated into ZANU-PF and is subsequently elevated to president of the party and state. The second scenario is that Mr. Mnangagwa gets reinstated as vice-president and goes on to support Mr. Mugabe's re-election at the ZANU-PF Special Congress in December, with a promise that Mr. Mugabe resigns soon after and transfers power to Mr. Mnangagwa. They will call it stability before democracy, and the people will embrace it because the attitude in Zimbabwe right now is anything but grace Mugabe. The Globe and Mail editorial board on the end of Mugabe with luck. This week's events could see Zimbabwe's government focus on the economy instead of on the greed and ambition of one man and his family. It's telling that a military coup, something the international community frowns upon, is in this case seen as the lesser of two evils. Craig Alexander and Barbara McLaren. The Globe and Mail on gender and trade agreements. While the global economy has profited enormously from increased trade and investment, there is greater awareness today about the unequal distribution of the gains. That is why Canada has included gender equality provisions into the negotiations of a revised North American Free Trade Agreement. This is important not only from a rights perspective but also because a country's ability to compete internationally and unlock the potential of trade is constrained when gender inequality is high. Linda Nazareth. The Globe and Mail on demographics and policy. Policy is a powerful thing, but its clout pales to that of demographics. This month, the Bank of England raised rates for the first time in a decade, following moves from the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada, and a clutch of other central banks. At the same time that central banks are sending interest rates higher, aging populations around the globe are creating a glut of savings that are influencing rates to move lower. It is a tug-of-war with some interesting implications. Goldie Hyder. The Globe and Mail on free trade with India. It has now been 7 years since Prime Ministers Stephen Harper and Manmohan Singh announced the launch of bilateral free trade negotiations between Canada and India. The time has come for their successors to finish the job, and to do so within the next year.